It's typical Trump. All bluster, very little substance. He talks a tough game, but then when pressed on it, he's an armchair tough guy. I hate to say it, but this is a guy who said that John McCain is not a war hero, yet he sought his own 5 military deferments because he says big, blustery things that people want to hear, but he goes way too far. And then when the military says, we won't follow illegal orders like torture or killing families, which is not loosening the rules of engagement, he suddenly realizes, wait, I might actually be commander-in-chief.
It's pretty incredible, right? I mean, because that same Pete Hegseth tonight is accusing 6 Democratic members of Congress of returning their country for warning troops not to obey unlawful orders. That includes Senator Mark Kelly. Hegseth, of course, has threatened to court-martial Kelly over that video. Out front now is K-File's Andrew Kaczynski.
You understand the stakes here like you understand your own breath because 6 Democratic lawmakers, including Senator Mark Kelly, appeared in a video encouraging military personnel to refuse illegal orders from Trump, prompting allegations of sedition from Trump and federal investigations. And now, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has called them the Seditious Six and says their message was despicable, reckless, and false. But here is where your blood should start to boil with the fury of historical vindication, because the CNN anchor in that clip just laid bare the most devastating political hypocrisy of this entire grotesque authoritarian moment, and you need to grasp the full magnitude of what just happened on that screen, because in 2016 Pete Hegseth warned that service members had a duty to refuse unlawful orders from a potential President Trump, when Trump was talking about torture and killing families of terrorists, and Hegseth echoed similar sentiments, saying the U.S. military won't follow unlawful orders from their commander-in-chief, and now that same man is threatening to court-martial a decorated Navy captain and sitting United States Senator for saying the exact same thing he said 8 years ago. And if that doesn't make your hands shake with rage at the sheer Orwellian doublethink on display, then you haven't been paying attention to how fascism actually works in real time. This is the moment where theory becomes practice, and where all those academic discussions about civil-military relations and the rule of law and the very foundations of constitutional democracy crash into the brutal reality of authoritarian consolidation, because the escalating confrontation between Kelly and figures in the Trump administration, including Hegseth, places long-standing norms about civilian oversight, military justice, and the separation of powers under scrutiny, and raises questions about constitutional protections, congressional independence, and executive branch authority. And you need to understand what is actually happening here beneath the surface noise, because this isn't about one senator or one video or even one hypocritical defense secretary. This is about whether the United States military will become a tool of personal presidential vengeance or whether it will remain bound by law. And Trump responded to the video on Truth Social saying seditious behavior punishable by death, before walking it back slightly, but still insisting it was sedition at the highest level. And when the President of the United States threatens sitting members of Congress with execution for reminding troops of their legal obligations, you are watching the collapse of democratic norms in real time. And the receipts just keep dropping like bombshells in this surreal nightmare timeline, because during a March 2016 Republican presidential debate, Trump was pressed by moderators about warnings from former military leaders that U.S. forces are legally obligated to reject unlawful orders, and when asked what he would do if the military refused to carry out those orders, Trump responded, "They won't refuse, they're not going to refuse me. Believe me," and that authoritarian declaration sent shockwaves through the national security establishment, and guess who was among those warning about Trump back then, and explaining that service members must refuse illegal commands, and Pete Hegseth himself, as a Fox News contributor and former National Guard officer, was out there echoing the consensus view that military members could face criminal consequences for carrying out illegal commands, and that the military's ethos requires refusing such orders, and now he's weaponizing the Department of Defense against people making that exact argument. And if you can't see the fascist playbook being executed here with chilling precision, then you need to wake up because history is screaming at us. Prosecuting Kelly for saying something that is literally true is going to raise the mother of all First Amendment objections, according to Georgetown law professor Steve Vladek, because Kelly didn't invent some seditious conspiracy theory, he simply stated what is codified in military law. The Manual for Courts Martial states that an order is lawful unless it is contrary to the Constitution, the laws of the United States, or lawful superior orders, or for some other reason, is beyond the authority of the official issuing it. And every single person who has ever served in uniform knows this, because it's drilled into you from day one. The Uniform Code of Military Justice codified the rule that a service member may refuse an order that is patently unlawful, and since the 1950s every soldier, sailor, marine, and airman has been trained on this point. Following the Nuremberg tribunals after World War II, when the world collectively decided that just following orders would never again be an acceptable defense for atrocities, and yet here we are in 2025, watching a defense secretary who once championed this principle, now calling it sedition, when Democrats remind troops of their legal duty. The legal architecture supporting Kelly is rock solid, and that's what makes this persecution so transparently political, because Kelly could be recalled to active service and court-martialed because of his status as a retired officer. But doing so over his role in the video would be extraordinary and would raise unprecedented separation of powers issues with the executive branch going after someone in the legislative branch, and constitutional law experts are already pointing out that the Constitution explicitly shields members of Congress from White House overreach, and having a United States senator subject to discipline at the behest of the Secretary of Defense and the President violates a core principle of legislative independence. But the Trump administration has shown repeatedly that it views constitutional constraints as suggestions rather than binding law, and Hegseth's public statements deriding Kelly's video appear to be a clear-cut case of unlawful command influence in which a superior commander implies or dictates a predetermined outcome for a military trial and thus makes a fair hearing impossible, which means even if they go forward, the entire proceeding would be tainted from the start. And now we need to talk about the profound historical irony that Pete Hegseth, the man threatening to prosecute people for telling troops not to follow illegal orders, is the same Pete Hegseth faces allegations of sexual assault from 2017, which he has denied, and in which no charges were filed, though he paid a settlement to the accuser, faced a whistleblower report in 2015 from former employees alleging he was repeatedly intoxicated on the job at Concerned Veterans for America, and that he had to be restrained from joining dancers on stage at a Louisiana strip club. His mother sent him an email in 2018 calling him an abuser of women during his contentious divorce, though she later disavowed it. And this is the man now sitting in judgment of Mark Kelly, a combat pilot astronaut who commanded space shuttle missions, whose wife Gabby Giffords nearly died from an assassination attempt, and who has dedicated his life to public service, and the contrast could not be more morally stark or politically revealing, because what we're witnessing is the MAGA movement's long-standing pattern of projecting its own sins onto its opponents, while demanding absolute loyalty to a dear leader who can do no wrong. While Trump can never face accountability for extrajudicial killings thanks to Supreme Court immunity, the question of whether Hegseth or Admiral Bradley, or the service members who pushed the button, could be prosecuted remains open, and some legal experts view the second strike as murder. But it defies logic that Trump's DOJ will seek accountability, meaning these service members are being put in legal jeopardy for following orders that may be prosecuted by a future administration, and that's exactly why Kelly's video was so important, and why the Trump administration is so desperate to silence it. We're watching the simultaneous weaponization and politicization of the military in ways that threaten the very fabric of democratic governance, because a U.S. district judge ruled that the Trump administration violated the Posse Comitatus Act by using National Guard troops for civilian law enforcement, and described the administration's actions as an apparent attempt at creating a national police force with the president as its chief, writing, "There was no rebellion, nor was civilian law enforcement unable to respond to protests and enforce the law," and another judge granted a restraining order on deployment in Portland, ruling that protest activity did not constitute a rebellion, and that Trump exceeded his authority, writing that Trump's narrative was untethered to facts, and this country has a long-standing and foundational tradition of resistance to government overreach, especially in the form of military intrusion into civil affairs, and this is a nation of constitutional law, not martial law, but the Trump administration simply ignores these court orders and continues deploying troops anyway, which is itself a constitutional crisis of the first order. The confirmation battle over Hegseth should have been the moment when the Senate exercised its constitutional duty to advise and consent, but instead we got a parade of Republican senators falling in line despite Democrats saying Hegseth's lack of experience, his past comments about women and black troops, and allegations of excessive drinking and sexual misconduct make him unfit to serve, and Senator Jack Reed saying Hegseth lacks the character and the competence to lead the Pentagon, and that his confirmation would be an insult to the men and women who have sworn to uphold their own apolitical duty to the Constitution. And Senator Joni Ernst, a female combat veteran and sexual assault survivor, eventually announced she would vote to confirm Hegseth after 2 closed-door meetings and an intense pressure campaign from Trump supporters that included threats of primary election challenges, which tells you everything you need to know about how fear and intimidation have replaced principled deliberation in the modern Republican Party. And here's where the philosophical stakes get truly terrifying, because service members have a legal enforceable duty to obey only lawful orders, and a legal excuse for disobedience under the limited circumstances of receiving an unlawful order, and the issue of presidential immunity is absolutely irrelevant to the underlying lawfulness of the order itself, and from the point of view of the military agent commanded to do some act, an order does not become lawful merely because an order is an official act of the commander-in-chief, and an order to assassinate a domestic political rival, or execute a coup, or use banned weapons were unlawful before the Trump immunity decision, and they remain unlawful after Bud, but the Trump administration is attempting to create a parallel reality where presidential orders are by definition lawful simply because the president issued them, which is the very definition of authoritarian rule and the antithesis of constitutional governance, and this is why Hegseth's threat against Kelly is so dangerous, because it's attempting to criminalize the act of reminding military personnel that they have both the right and the duty to disobey unlawful orders, which would effectively erase one of the most important legal safeguards against military atrocities. The historical parallel that should haunt everyone watching this unfold is that prior to World War II, U.S. service members could assert a defense of superior orders, which would excuse even illegal conduct, so long as the actions were in accordance with orders, but the Nuremberg tribunals after World War II established in international law that obeying an unlawful order does not absolve an individual of responsibility for atrocity, and we built an entire international legal order on the principle that individuals have moral agency and legal responsibility even within military hierarchies, and that soldiers cannot hide behind the chain of command when ordered to commit crimes, and now the Trump administration is trying to reverse engineer that principle and return to a pre-Nuremberg framework where the president's word is law and questioning orders is sedition, and if you can't connect those dots to the broader authoritarian project, then you're not paying attention to the systematic dismantling of democratic institutions happening before our eyes. The sheer audacity of Pete Hegseth threatening Mark Kelly while simultaneously having his own credibility in tatters is almost too much to process, because Hegseth called for a sweeping overhaul of how the military handles allegations of hazing and other abuse, saying department policy defining conduct that constitutes hazing, bullying, and harassment is overly broad and jeopardizing combat readiness, and he wants to allow drill sergeants to put their hands on recruits, ransack the rooms of enlistees, and bring back shark attacks where drill sergeants swarm enlistees during basic training, which reads like a recipe for returning to the bad old days of systemic abuse, and creating an environment where sexual assault and harassment can flourish. And meanwhile, a Democratic Senator Tammy Duckworth, a veteran, called it insane that Trump would nominate someone like Hegseth after decades of efforts within the armed services to address sexual assault, because they've spent years implementing reforms after the murder of Vanessa Guillen, and other cases exposed how the military's culture enabled predators, and now they're handing the keys to someone credibly accused of being part of that very problem. The ideological framework driving all of this is laid bare in the 2025 National Security Strategy, which replaces the post-Cold War consensus with a doctrine of civilizational realism and hard sovereignty, and posits that the American Republic is under siege, not just from foreign adversaries like China, but from internal subversion and a crisis of cultural identity. The strategy describes envisioning a narrower role for America, largely abandoning mention of protecting democracy or freedom to focus on reducing migration and pursuing business deals, and calls to reassert and enforce the Monroe Doctrine, and depicts Europe as a victim of civilizational erasure, which is straight-up ethno-nationalist rhetoric, dressed up as geopolitical strategy, and represents a fundamental break with liberal internationalism and the entire post-World War II order. And when you combine that ideological shift with the gutting of institutional constraints and the persecution of dissent, you have all the ingredients for democratic backsliding into something far darker. The attack on Kelly and the 5 other Democratic lawmakers is also deeply personal and threatening, because Trump took to Truth Social to recommend the lawmakers be jailed and put on trial for seditious behavior, and in one post he wrote that such behavior is punishable by death, and Kelly has accused the administration of trying to intimidate him and others by having the FBI interview all of them, and the senator has expressed concerns about his family's safety since the president's Truth Social posts. And when you have a president using the power of his office to threaten elected officials with death and sicking federal law enforcement on them, and creating an environment where their families fear for their safety, you are watching textbook authoritarianism and the use of state power to silence opposition, and it's happening not in some distant country we read about, but right here in the United States in December 2025, and the fact that roughly half the country either supports it or shrugs with indifference is perhaps the most terrifying aspect of all. But here's what you need to carry forward as you process this information and figure out how to resist, because the legal experts are unanimous that one retired Marine Corps judge and former federal prosecutor said the cases he has seen of retirees being called back are more like extreme examples of fraud or some child pornography cases, and I've not seen anything like the kind of the wackadoodle thing they're trying to do to Senator Kelly for essentially exercising his First Amendment right to free speech, which they don't like. And another expert said saying that you shouldn't break the law cannot be a crime, and he did not do it as a military officer. He did it as a civilian, and Kelly's status as a senator could block the Pentagon's investigation because of constitutional protections for the separation of powers, which means the administration is on legally shaky ground, and they know it, but they're counting on intimidation and the complicity of Republican lawmakers to let them get away with it anyway. And that's where public pressure and sustained resistance becomes absolutely critical, because institutional guardrails only work when people are willing to defend them. The through line connecting all of this is that Pete Hegseth in 2016 understood what we're supposed to understand now, which is that military personnel swear an oath to the Constitution, not to a person, and that lawful orders must be distinguished from unlawful ones, and that the military must remain subordinate to law, rather than to the whims of a commander-in-chief. And Hegseth is not the only administration official who has affirmed that the military should disobey illegal orders. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth is on video saying the same thing in 2016, but to this administration, Trump can't break the law, only the people who disobey him do, and that's the authoritarian logic in its purest form, where the leader is above the law, and opposition to the leader is by definition illegal. Attorney General Pam Bondi wrote in a brief to the Supreme Court that the military would not carry out a patently unlawful order from the president to kill non-military targets, and indeed service members are required not to do so, when she was trying to defend Trump's immunity claim, and now that same principle is being branded as sedition, when Democrats articulate it, which reveals the complete intellectual and moral bankruptcy of this entire exercise. The stakes could not be higher, and the moment could not be more urgent, because what happens with Mark Kelly will determine whether Congress can exercise independent oversight of the executive branch, whether service members can trust that legal orders mean lawful orders, whether the military will be weaponized against domestic political opponents, and whether we still live in a constitutional republic or have descended into something resembling soft authoritarianism with democratic aesthetics. Using the military for partisan political purposes damages the relationship the military has with society, degrades public confidence, sows division within the military, and risks the military being looked upon as any other interest group. And what is most required is for civilian political leaders to stop dragging the military into partisan political fights, and the military's norm of nonpartisanship ensures the military remains subordinate to civilian authority and upholds its oath to the Constitution. But Trump has spent his entire political career destroying norms, and Hegseth was installed specifically to be a political enforcer rather than an institutionalist, and that's why this fight matters so desperately. And finally, you need to grapple with the sickening reality that the Pentagon has not yet announced whether it will proceed with recalling Kelly to active duty for a court-martial, and the Navy Secretary had until December 10 to provide Hegseth with the review's outcome, and as of early December, Kelly continues to maintain a public schedule and has repeated his determination not to step aside, which means this threat remains active and ongoing, and Kelly has demonstrated exactly the kind of courage we need from our elected officials by refusing to be intimidated and continuing to do his job, and the contrast between his service, his valor, his commitment to constitutional principles, and the rank hypocrisy and authoritarian impulses of his persecutors could not be more glaring, and this is the fight for the soul of American democracy, playing out in real time, and everyone who cares about the rule of law and civilian control of the military and the basic principles of constitutional governance needs to pay attention and speak out and resist, because the fascism isn't coming, it's already here, and the question is whether we have the collective courage to name it and fight it before it's too late.